Russian strikes against Ukraine killed at least 11 civilians and injured at least 51 over just one past day. Russia launched 78 drones against Ukraine overnight on December 1st. Ukrainian anti-aircraft missile units, electronic warfare units, and mobile military groups on the ground downed 32 drones in Kyiv, Chernihiv, Cherkasy, Sumy, Poltava, and Zhytomyr oblasts. 45 drones were lost, allegedly due to electronic warfare countermeasures. Russia also attacked the Dniprovsky district of Dnipropetrovsk Oblast on the evening of November 30th, killing 4 more people and injuring at least 24. President Zelenskyy noted that Russia targeted the village of Tsarichanka with a missile. 18 people are in hospital, 7 of which are in a serious condition, Governor Serhiy Lutsak reported at early morning on local time on December 1st. The injured victims include an 11-year-old boy. I know that many Orbans and Fizos and Scholzes of this world are saying that they fear escalation in this war, while obviously they are okay with Putin's one-sided escalation and do not really care how many Ukrainians will die because of it. Maybe Orbans and Fizos and Scholzes think that Ukraine is, a testing ground of sorts?
Ukraine is not a testing ground for weapons. Ukraine is a sovereign and independent state, yet Russia continues its efforts to destroy our people, sow fear and panic, and weaken us. Volodymyr Zelenskyy, President of Ukraine.
Well, if I even need to say anything about the above stated as a conclusion or a resume, then that would be this. Whoever thinks Russia is not a terrorist country led by a bloodthirsty, warmongering, outdated Soviet thug, Vladimir Putin, but is a, fighter for freedom instead, welcome to Ukraine for just 1 week. And we talk then. Well, if you survive, of course.
Good question. The key element here is the Assad regime. He is the son of the elder Assad, so this is a whole dynasty. It's important to understand that this dynasty is Alawite, which is a confessional minority in Syria. In Syria, the main population consists of Sunni Muslims. Alawites, there are literally around 1 to 2%, something like that. Well, not many, to put it simply, less than 5%. And essentially, the clans consisting of this minority in the Middle East, religious denomination is generally more significant than national identity, meaning the region is mainly divided along religious lines. For example, in Lebanon, people tend to live separately, with Christians, Shiites, Sunnis, and so on, each in their own areas. Syria is no exception. And therefore, the Assad regime is the trigger, meaning if we look at any forces there, from radical ISIS terrorists to the moderate Syrian opposition, they all share one thing in common. They are all against the Assad regime. In other words, the Assad regime is, simply put, the trigger for what the war is about. They want to overthrow it. Of course, each of these forces has its own vision. Some want to establish a caliphate. Others want just to prevent the Alawites from being in power. Because the Alawites in power are not just about the Alawites. Syria, under the Assad family, has been constantly held together with blood, meaning consistently suppressing. Protests and any demonstrations were suppressed with maximum brutality. Therefore, for many of these groups, factions, movements, and so on, it is simply a personal interest. And separately, of course, there is revenge for those who were retaliated against, killed, tortured, and so on. Groups are extremely diverse, catering to every taste and preference. There are separate Kurdish movements that are largely supported by the Americans. These are the opposed Kurds, supporters of the Kurdistan Workers' Party, which is considered a terrorist organization and is at war with Turkey. Interestingly, the Americans also consider the Kurdistan Workers' Party to be a terrorist organization, yet they support the opposites, who are followers of the Kurdistan Workers' Party.
Here is Abdullah Öcalan, their leader, who is in prison in Turkey, referred to as APO. That's what the APOkists call themselves.
So the Americans are supporting them, including the Kurdish opposites, despite recognizing the PKK, the Kurdistan Workers' Party, as terrorists. The areas marked in yellow are where the Kurds are located. But there are also various Arab tribes there. The Americans organized and support it all, which is called the Syrian Democratic Forces, or SDF. This consists of Kurds plus some Arabs. Here are the Syrian Democratic Forces. Mainly they are marked in yellow on the map. Additionally, there are, well, of course, the Americans themselves are there. Let me remind you that American Marines are stationed on Syrian territory, exactly where the Kurds and these Syrian Democratic Forces are located. Separately, there is the Syrian National Army. The Syrian National Army is an opposition army to the Assad regime, which is at war with them. They are also currently participating in the offensive on Aleppo and, in general, in the offensive against the Assad regime forces. Turkey supports them directly, so these are essentially Turkish-supported forces. Syrian opposition army, which predominantly consists of Syrians. Indeed, these are Syrian citizens who are called the Syrian National Forces, but they are backed by Turkey. Separately, there is Hayat Tahrir al-Sham, which is often referred to as HTS. This is a radical Islamist group. He is led by the rather infamous figure Al-Filani. Yeah, you can learn about him. He once served time in an American prison. He led a branch of Al-Qaeda. He was involved in the establishment of ISIS. Later, he had a falling out with ISIS and parted ways with them. Ultimately, now he leads Hayat Tahrir al-Sham. It won't be officially stated anywhere that they are supported by Turkey, but it's like everyone knows, as they say. This is also a group of radicals called rebels. In English, the word rebel has a neutral connotation. So there can be any kind of rebels. Usually when we say rebels in Russian, it immediately has a positive connotation. They have a positive connotation, but in English, it's simpler here. Therefore, this is also a very important actor. And HTS, Ayat Tahrir al-Sham, played a leading role. This offensive currently unfolding in Aleppo has them mainly, the Hayat group is leading, well, not only them, there are also some other smaller groups, but they are not as noticeable. They fade into the background of the major players I've just listed. And most importantly, those who have support. This is not from the opposition side, but on the other side, there is Assad. Assad has always been supported by Russia and Iran. Erdogan and Assad couldn't reach an agreement, and now they are surprised by the scale of the successes, how everything has crumbled. So it is likely the offensive could have and should have been a pressure factor on Assad. In the end, everything just collapsed, and they managed to enter the city. Now the plans will change, as they say, following the script. Although Plan A is still in place, initially there was an idea to conduct a large, serious offensive operation. Well, it's clear that Erdogan's actions are not random. Everything was prepared for this. It's obvious that this is happening with Turkey's sanction. Broadly speaking, let me remind you, Turkey is part of NATO. And not just NATO, it has the second strongest army in the alliance. Turkey represents a vacuum in strategic relations with the United States. So there's no need to think that all of this is happening with mere whimsical vacuums. Why now? Because a crucial asset of Assad, which helped them maintain the front, Hezbollah, has been taken out by Israel. Hezbollah fought with its fighters, commanders, and specialists
in Syria for many years.
And these are motivated fighters. Those who wanted to fight and knew how to fight. No, in recent months, they have been completely decapitated by Israel. No, this refers not only to the elimination of Hassan Nasrallah, but also the entire military leadership. And these are not just military leaders, these are people who have fought in Syria for years and know every inch of the terrain. In other words, they were knowledgeable, had connections, and commanded authority. The entire leadership was wiped out by Israel, as well as the fighters themselves. We know for sure that it numbers in the thousands, at least 2,000. The figure goes up to 3,500. Eliminated. That's a lot. That's entire brigades, you could say. And these are not just any fighters. These are motivated fighters from Hezbollah. And thousands more are wounded. We remember those who lost like eyes during an airstrike and so on. And thousands more are wounded. Many thousands of Hezbollah fighters are completely out of the game, and those who survived are staying put in Lebanon. They will not move into Iran. Until recently, the war with Israel had not ended, but now there should be a ceasefire for 60 days, assuming no one violates it. So Israel remains in its positions and so forth. Hezbollah hasn't gone anywhere. The forces it still has are, of course, being kept in Lebanon. Therefore, this is indeed a favorable moment for an offensive because one of the key factors has been eliminated. The second important factor, already mentioned about Aleppo, which was captured from the Russians, is Wagner. What happened with the Wagner group is also well known, allegedly ordered to be dismantled by Putin, and the Wagner operatives either integrated into the Ministry of Defense or are fighting in Ukraine or somewhere in Africa. I wouldn't call all this by such names. I would just emphasize that it clearly shows us how all wars are closely connected with what is happening now. Because without the Ukraine factor, when Russia's main forces are involved, including aviation and Wagner, and the very fact that Wagner was destroyed as a force by Russia itself due to the factor of the proxy war with Ukraine. On the other hand, Israel, the war in Israel, because Israel decapitated Hezbollah and destroyed the majority of its fighters and all their strategists and field commanders. Without this, the advance right now would have been impossible. So we see that all these conflicts are very closely connected. At the very least, we can consider it as a single global conflict if we wish. However, whether we view it this way or not, they are linked. That's simply a fact. Is a ceasefire in Syria possible with the victory of one faction? Or are we entangled in this conflict for years and years ahead?
Ref
No,
Syria.
for 13 years now. I reminded that until recently there was a ceasefire. Essentially, as the Kremlin says, and Turkey itself, Turkey violated this ceasefire regime. They placed the responsibility on Turkey, not on the Syrian National Army, not on Hatak, but on Turkey directly. We'll see what happens next. They might agree on a new ceasefire, but this war has been going on for 13 years. There's no end in sight. It will likely continue for a long time. Well, at least for now, there will often be a mood like that. Because, as I mentioned, it is the main trigger of the civil war and the reason why it is happening. The Soviet Union, of course, it wants to have leverage in the Middle East in the global confrontation between the socialist bloc and the capitalist bloc of the USA. Therefore, the Soviet Union supported Egypt, supported Syria, and we know they supported Iraq and a whole bunch of other countries in Africa, Latin America, and so on. For the same reason, the Soviet Union supported, let's say, North Korea or Vietnam, for instance, and so on and so forth. In other words, the Soviet Union was part of its geopolitical global confrontation of blocs on the world stage, and Russia, as a pale shadow of the Soviet Union, simply maintains control over Syria, since all this weaponry that the Soviet Union once provided was given for free, making the regime in Syria indebted to Russia and therefore under its influence. And Russia, which claims to also be an international player and still a global power, didn't want to simply lose such leverage.
Мировым государством, державой мировой и так далее, не хотела просто терять такой рычаг давления.
It is simply an asset. Therefore, when Assad's regime was truly threatened with collapse in 2015, Russia directly sent in its contingent. That means the war in Syria had started even before 2015. They provided him with weapons. They supplied him with tanks, well, not airplanes, but tanks and other weapons and so on. Some Russian specialists were likely involved. But until 2015, there wasn't a direct contingent with aviation, Russian redeployment, and so on. When it became clear that Assad was not managing, his regime was truly on the verge of collapse. Yes, and the Russians managed to stabilize the situation, but now we see that Russia is fully embroiled in the war in Ukraine, fully at a large scale, and it lacks the resources for the war in Ukraine. And therefore, where would they find additional resources for Syria? Yes, I can add that I think, looking more broadly, this is the West's response to Russia and Iran. It is known that pressure is always applied to the weakest link. So now Syria is being pressured, as it is the weak link for both Iran and Russia. That is, Syria is indeed the next step in the geopolitical game with Turkey, the USA, and, well, NATO. Well, the USA and Turkey are NATO. About Putin's assets in Syria, including in future negotiations on regulation, globally, not just about Ukraine, but globally on many issues, so that they can confront him with this. So what all we're taking this from you, you won't have it anymore, and so on. So don't think that events in Syria are happening on their own, just by coincidence. The Western Bloc and the Alliance are not unaware or ignorant of what is happening, and they do monitor the situation. To put it mildly, they are a bit more informed than we are by tenfold. They are better and more thoroughly aware of what is actually going on there.